Hey, welcome. Hi out there. Welcome to A Real Point of View. Um, I'm your host, Greg Morgan, and I'm the Real Movie Guy. And joining me currently is the movie maven herself, Miss Karen D. And hopefully, one of our other cohorts, Mr. Stephen C., will be joining us. The guy doesn't pick a bad movie.
Allegedly.
Hopefully, hopefully, he'll be joining us later on, if possible. But without further ado, we are going to we talk about movies obviously all the time, and we talk about good, bad, the ugly, which is a movie, and we try to lead you down the path of righteousness when it comes to film. Hopefully, uh, seeing really good films, films that we suggest, that kind of thing, and we look at a myriad of things. So one of the things that I thought was interesting and might be interesting to look at is, sometimes you'll watch a movie, you're not really paying attention that much, you just trying to find something out there to see, and you come across a movie and say, well, I guess I'll give it a shot. And you give it a shot, and then you realize, hey, this is a better movie than I thought it was going to be. I remember just a thing that happened to me once. One of my coworkers had come up to me and said, "Hey, this is really good movie out there. You should watch it." And I'm like, "Well, I kind of saw the previews and some of the trailers. It wasn't really that great on watching it, so I kind of avoided it." And then a different coworker came up to me and says, "Hey, have you seen this movie?" And I'm like, "That's the same movie." He's like, "Yeah, have you seen that yet?" And I'm like, "Oh, no, I haven't seen it yet." He goes, "Man, it was really good." So obviously, there are other people out there who find films that they didn't necessarily think was going to be that great, gave it a shot, gave it a chance, and decided, hey, this isn't really that bad. You know, that movie wasn't what I expected. And so, what we're going to talk about today is movies that we didn't expect to be that great that ended up being much better than we thought. So, my movie of the evening is going to be Rampage, starring Dwayne Johnson and Naomi Harris. What about you, Karen? What film did you come up with that kind of fits our scenario for tonight?
My movie, my movie is Murder on the Orient Express. The 2017 version that stars Kenneth Branagh and was produced and directed by Kenneth Branagh.
Now, what drove you to that movie? Was it a movie that you were avoiding, kind of like what I was alluding to a moment ago, or was it just something you say, "Hey, you're browsing, trying to figure out a movie that you'd like to see," and then all of a sudden you came across this? What actually led you to the watching this film?
Well, actually, it was kind of like I kind of backed into it because I remember when the movie first came out, Leslie Odom, I remember Leslie Odom was in the trailer for the movie playing a doctor. And I thought, gee, this would be really good to see. But it was Christmas time, and I didn't, make it a point to see it the first weekend it was out. And by the time I was, actively looking for something to see, the reviews had come out for the movie and they were pretty middling, pretty unenthusiastic, lukewarm, shall we say. And Kenneth Branagh has, sort of a little bit of a fluctuating record as far as his movie projects go. I mean, he's valiant in his attempts, which don't always succeed. Some of them do. It's not for lack of trying on his part. I mean, I think he really cares about the craft of movie making, but some things just work better than others. And like, well, so I lost enthusiasm after hearing the reviews come out that weren't that great. So it kind of went to the back burner. A couple of weeks ago, I was visiting, family, and we were looking for something to watch in the home theater. And and you know, mom was like, "Well, I'll watch anything you want to watch," and it's like, "Oh, okay." And then Murder for the Orient Express was available, and she was like, "Well, I'll watch it," and I'm like, "Well." Because she really likes Agatha Christie, and as it turned out, she had just given her granddaughter a book of Agatha Christie for her birthday. So she really liked the Murder on the Orient Express story, and I'd always liked the story too. So I'm
Mhm.
like, well, let's just watch it. And so we watched it, and I was really pleasantly surprised at how good I thought the movie was. I don't know where the Fair to Midland reviews come from because there's so much about this movie that works as far as I'm concerned.
And that's the funny thing about people's opinion. And obviously, we're on here, internet film critics ourselves, obviously spurting out our own opinions about everything all the time. But it's interesting to be able to explore and investigate a little bit further, even though there are people out there who are either not really for the film, or they're naysayers, or all the total gambit of things as far as what people's thoughts and opinions are about movies. And so, there are a lot of movies out there that maybe the genre is what turns them off, people off. But The Orient Express is really kind of a classic. This is obviously a remake. There was another one, not that long ago, probably at least a decade or two, possibly though. But sometimes when you see a movie again, or what's the word I'm looking for? Reestablish another thought about something, that sometimes brings it to light. And in this case, Murder on the Orient Express, a movie that I was thinking about watching too, this conversation about it may give me the impetus to watch it as well. And similarly with this film, for me, in watching Rampage with Dwayne Johnson, um, it's basically about a primatologist who deals with um, a very close and passionate relationship with a primate, which is a silverback gorilla in this film. And it reminds me of films in the past that I watched. And there were a lot of people out there who are big fans of King Kong. And I'm not saying that I'm not one of them. I'm one of them. But there's so many different versions of King Kong, just like there's so many different versions of Godzilla. That was for you, Steve. And so, but one of the movies that I saw years ago that I really enjoyed watching was a movie called Mighty Joe Young.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
when I
I remember
saw
that.
the Yeah, and when I saw the previews, or the trailers for this particular film, it reminded me of that. Now, it didn't make me go watch it any sooner, but I think for me, I was kind of flipping through different films one day, just trying to see if there's something I might want to watch. And for me lately, Dwayne Johnson, he's been in a myriad of films, and the ones that I had seen actually were pretty good. So I have a working relationship with Dwayne Johnson, in the sense that he's been more positive for me to watch, as opposed to being negative and or just mundane. So I thought, maybe I'll give it a shot. He hasn't had a bad track record with me yet, and I remember Mighty Joe Young, and so I'm thinking, okay, I wonder if this is anything similar. So I wasn't giving it a big amount of credence early on. It wasn't a movie that I was just racing out to see, but then I started watching it. Now, a lot of times when you have science fiction space films, um, and they're trying to incorporate so many different aspects. Anymore, we're getting the aspects of so much FX out there, so much special effects, computer ability, digital ability to try to get us to see these films. And the way that film studios are making these films anymore, they're able to bring a lot more to the table than they were even a decade ago. So, with that being said, I'm thinking, okay, so what's the essence of this film? So let me get to that. I'm just kind of rambling a little bit. The essence of this film is there are three animals that are infected by a pathogen that makes them grow excessively quickly. And in the midst of that, it also changes their demeanor. And in this film, we have um, Dwayne Johnson's character, who is again a primatologist who has a wonderful working relationship, where he's even taught this particular primate how to do sign language, so they can actually have conversations. And so he's watching this affected friend get grow in size, grow in anger, grow in all these things, and move further and further away from him and his relationship with him. And so in this film, with all these crazy things going on, my first thought would be, yeah, I'm going to leave this alone. I've heard this scenario, I've seen this scenario, but you know what? A lot of things out there in the world are not things that are unique. They are things that we are have seen before, but maybe there's just a nuance that's been added to it. And so in this film, in watching the different creatures as they grow, and watching uh, the villains that are in this film who are trying to perpetrate this essence of this pathogen to make money and become even richer than they already are. Um, and the people who are trying to say, this is not a good idea, with this in this particular film. Naomi Harris is also one of the co-stars in this film, who is a geneticist who's trying to let them know that what you're doing is going to cause more horrific issues as opposed to good things. And so you have the two of them together working in tandem to try to eradicate what's happened and also get to the bottom of who's doing this and get them, locked up and put away because they're just trying to do crazy stuff. So when I first saw this, I was thinking, it's going to be like that kind of crazy stuff. But the more I watched, the more I was involved. I got hooked, and became much more of a fan of what was going on and what they were trying to do and the different characters. And I think it's Michael Dean Morgan, right? I think is the name of the actor. Um,
I don't know. Are you talking about
no,
Jeffrey
it's
Dean Morgan?
Jeffrey Dean Morgan. Thank you. And so Jeffrey Dean Morgan has a role in this film, and his role initially is the quote unquote. We don't know if he's CIA, FBI, but his role in this situation is to capture this primate, in this case the gorilla, and take him back to wherever to so that the scientists can do whatever. And they keep trying to tell me, they do, he keeps growing every, you know seems like every 2 minutes he's growing and growing. Oh, we got it, we can handle it, and they really can't. So but what was cool about his role in here is, at first you goes think he's going to be the total antagonist, he's going to cause a lot of issues. He actually understands. And rarely do you have that understanding. Usually that guy is the guy who gets killed or thrown off, cliff, because he's too rigid. He's not going to change his ideology or his thought patterns. But that's not the case here. And so they gain another ally, which tries to help them get through all the other red tape and craziness that's going on out there in the midst, to try to help, bring this thing to a proper fruition. But it was one of those films that grabs you. It's a good combination of different characters, as opposed as in conclusion, with um, really good acting. I actually really like this film. It made a very fictional situation seem very believable, and the relationship with again between Dwayne Johnson's character and the gorilla, the silverback gorilla, is really cool. And although the ending's a little quirky, it's quirky cool. And so, um, if I was to look at this film like I was originally thinking, I might have given it a 5 or a 6, maybe. But after seeing the film, after understanding that, hey, it exceeded my expectations, first of all, and then it was actually very enjoyable to watch, a little bit fun to watch. It does raise your adrenaline a little bit at points. I give this one a more of an 8, 7.88.
Well,
So
that's not praise coming from you.
yeah, and so it was really a very enjoyable film, and I think a lot of times for me, if it's enjoyable, I give it a little bit better rating, of course. But um, it made sense in the midst of where I thought it would not.
Hmm.
Yeah, so and the same thing with Mighty Joe Young those years ago, because I think they came out in the '70s. I think Charlize Theron was in that film, so it might have been in the '80s, maybe. I don't know. Um, I think Charlize Theron was actually in the remake of Mighty Joe Young, because they've actually had two, and both were
Hmm.
actually pretty good. Um, but you know, along that same line, I didn't think that that was going to be that great. Wasn't going to give it a lot of credence at all, and it ended up being a really good film. And speaking of credence, the movie that the different gentlemen were trying to talk to me about was Creed, a movie that I wasn't going to give very much, wasn't thinking about necessarily watching, and with the two gentlemen whose opinions I hold pretty stable, solid. I took a look at that film, and that was actually better than I thought it would be too. Now, by no means it was no Academy Award winning film, but it did give a little bit more uh, understanding about Apollo Creed, and then watching his son also come through the ranks with um, Rocky helping him through that. But it was a lot better movie than I thought it was going to be as well. So sometimes you need to find a way to see films that you don't think are going to be that great and give them an opportunity to either wow you or disappoint you, but at least giving it an opportunity. That way you can tell. Because I think a lot of times we miss a lot of films that we don't give a lot of credence to. And the last film I wanted to mention in that regard was one that you suggested, Karen. I was going to bypass it, and I didn't. And it's actually one of my favorite films, and that's Coco.
Oh, yeah.
And I think because of the subject matter, a lot of people aren't watching the film. And I think now, after watching the film, it is the subject matter the reason why you should watch the film. And then you'll find, I found, that it took me through every gambit of emotions that I have. And to me, that's a wonderful film. And don't let it be a deterrent because it's animated. This isn't a very adult film. It is well enough facilitated for children, but it's really an adult film with an adult theme and some really very interesting family um, uh, capabilities, whether they be uh, legacy, whether they be the future, the current essence. It's just a really enriched story that goes through all the gamuts, in my opinion. So another film too that um, you should watch. People should watch. But if anyone asks me about Rampage, I'm going to suggest it. I think it's a really good film.
Well, maybe I'll check it out then. I mean, I like Dwayne Johnson anyway, and one of the films that for me is almost a guilty pleasure because I've watched it multiple times. And I'm like, I have no business watching this film even once, let alone multiple times, but I did anyway. It was San Andreas.
Which I haven't seen yet. So I'm going to take your advice and take a look at that.
It's like I sometimes it's just a fun movie. I kind of have a thing for disaster movies. It's kind of like just like one of the things I like the way some people like horror movies, I like disaster movies. So if there's an earthquake, a tornado, or a typhoon or something, some natural disaster involved, I'm all over it. And this one, it's just you just don't know what's going to happen from one minute to the next, and Dwayne Johnson is the hero, but you don't know how he's going to be the hero, and of course he's a tortured soul and all this other stuff, and you don't know if he's going to save the day or not, and it's just like this thrilling kind of joyride, even though it involves a disaster of epic proportions. So I've watched that movie at least 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh yeah. And even though I know, I was joking with a work colleague about it because she watched it too, and she just kind of said, have you seen? I watched it again. I'm like, I did too. And even though I knew everything that was going to happen, I was still sitting on the edge of my seat.
Mm-hmm.
So, so it was fun.
Yeah, and I find going back to Dwayne Johnson for just a moment, he's positioned himself pretty well in the different situations that he's been able to um, uh, affix himself in the film industry. And he's been in a myriad of films. Now, I'm not saying that everyone, as I alluded to before, is not a great film, but he's done some really good films. And one of them, now I know he's in the Fast and the Furious movies. He's found a way to had found a way to get into those movies. But that movie that I had seen him in was with Billy Bob Thornton, which was Faster. I really liked that movie. I really liked that movie for him. Um, and another movie early on was one called Gridiron Gang, where he and Exhibit are basically caretakers, social workers, caretakers of these at-risk kids who would otherwise be in prison. So they've found a way to help them get through their situation by having them play football in the prison system. So he's kind of multifaceted. He's this big giant guy, but he can either be lovable in some of these films. I really like the film. I can't think of the name of it now. With he and comedian Kevin Hart. That is hilarious.
Central Intelligence Agency.
Central Intelligence. That is
Or it's
hilarious,
called
man.
Central Intelligence, not Central Intelligence Agency. It's just called Central Intelligence. But yeah, that was very funny.
That was cracking me up. And so he can be comedic, he can be hard and rigid. I mean, he's doing the actor thing and he's doing it well, I think. And so it helps me to give him another shot every time I hear he's in something. I'll say, okay, well, what's that about? Let me take a look. You know, he's becoming that actor. So um, he's had successes in sports. He's had successes in theater sports, which is what I call wrestling. And he's had
Don't call it that to his face.
and he's had success in comedic roles, and he's had success in very dramatic roles. So that's the essence of an actor, a true actor who's putting himself out there in many different roles. And I don't know who his agent is, but his agents got him working, and he's doing a lot of stuff. So it's great. And this is one of those films that I think people should give a chance. So again, it's Rampage with Dwayne Johnson and Naomi Harris. And so um, also Coco, really good movie. I think I'm gonna watch that again soon. So any other movies that have floated your boat about
Well, I
you
haven't talked
expected?
about Murder on the Orient Express yet.
Oh,
I
good.
just
Let's
introduced it.
go. Let's go for it. Give us
Oh,
Murder Express.
right. Well, I was waiting for you to ask me.
There's a train involved.
Well, thanks for ruining it. No, I'm teasing. Yes, there's a train involved. So yeah, you were asking before when Murder on the Orient, you were alluding to this being a remake, and there was a film, Murder on the Orient Express. The original was done in 1974, starring Albert Finney and Lauren Bacall, and Sean Connery was in it. And there were some other just, sort of like relatively well-known movie stars that were part of the cast of Murder on the Orient Express. And besides those three, I can't recall off the top of my head what some of them were. But anyway, 1974, that was done. So let me get to the 2017 version. That was directed by Kenneth Branagh, and like I said before, and also produced by him along with a host of other people, including Ridley Scott. It was written by Michael Green, and Michael Green sort of used Agatha Christie's book, Murder on the Orient Express, as a jumping off point. And I can't recall off the top of my head how true to the Agatha Christie book, Murder on the Orient Express, the original movie made in 1974 was. I can say that in 2017, Kenneth Branagh and Michael Green took significant departures from the original story that Agatha Christie set up in terms of casting and in terms of storylines. For example, in 1974, there was a Colonel Arbuthnot. In the 2017 version, there was Dr. Arbuthnot that was played by Leslie Odom, who's African American. And in the 1974 version, of course, there were no African Americans. 2017, Leslie Odom was cast, and there's a relationship between he and Daisy Ridley of Star Wars fame. She plays a governess in Murder on the Orient Express, and as it turns out, they have a romantic relationship going that they're trying to keep under wraps until they can get overseas. He's American, she's British. They met at some earlier point before the movie started, and they want to get away from America for obvious reasons, and settle in Europe. So that, but of course, has nothing to do with what Agatha Christie wrote. It's simply a subplot that, you know, may or may not drive the story at all, but it certainly wasn't, you know, it certainly wasn't something that Agatha Christie came up with. That was dramatic departure taken by Michael Green and Kenneth Branagh. So, you know, and then there are other stories like that. Johnny Depp plays this sort of corrupt businessman who asks Hercule Poirot for protection, but I don't recall that person from the 1974 version, for example. So it's different things like that. Let me get to why I thought this movie. I guess I approached this movie because I was basically desperate for something to watch, and so I guess I was prepared to be disappointed. So I was pleasantly surprised, and what really surprised me so much wasn't the acting or the story. It was the production, the overall production, and the production design, the look of the movie. I think so much work went into this, and it was really just, I think, lovingly crafted. Like, I think Kenneth Branagh and the cinematographer, and I had his name here just a second ago. The cinematographer is Harris Zambarlikos, who's, I mean, he's not somebody whose work that I'm familiar with. I mean, he's in his early 50s. He's done, he was a cinematographer on Thor, Batman Begins, Mamma Mia. So he definitely has some major film work to his credit. But anyway, there was just a lot of research that went into how to set up the look of the places where the train departed, the look of the train itself, especially the interior, the landscape through which the train traveled. Just stunning, absolutely stunning. And I'm pretty sure parts of this were filmed in New Zealand, which is apparently the only beautiful spot on the face of the earth, on the face of the earth. So just these gorgeous mountains. There's this great scene where the train derails because an avalanche occurs. And so the train is basically knocked off the tracks by the avalanche. And they have to sit there and wait for a repair team to come along and get the train back on the tracks. And they're, you know, those rail cars where there are people on either side and they're moving a lever up and down, and that's how they propel, like one of those railway cars. That's what they're propelling to get to the snowbound train. And then they're just going to, I guess they have some sort of snow mover or something. Like, the train itself is not supposed to be derailed because it's a huge train with the big point in the front that is basically designed to deflect snow. But the avalanche was so powerful that just didn't work. Anyway, the photography of that was really stunning. And there's just this image of this huge monster of a train laid helpless by what doesn't seem to be a lot of snow. And it's like, wow, that's just, it's so ironic the way that some large, you know, mammoth machine can just be completely, you know, thrown off course by Mother Nature. And I just like the image of that, just that. And the train was just helpless there for at least a day or two. But that also served as a plot point to kind of drive the story forward, because while they were stopped and had and the people on the train, the passengers, literally had nothing else to do. Well, it was time to focus on the murder. That gave them the time to focus on the murder because there was literally nothing else to do except to wait for this poor little railway car, which was being hand driven from a long way away to get there. So it's like, okay, well, let's just how did this murder happen, and who could have done it, and who had the the motive to commit this terrible murder. So that was interesting. Now, Kenneth Branagh played Hercule Poirot, who's the famous Belgian detective. And I remember my mom saying, "Oh, I really liked what Kenneth Branagh did with the Poirot character." And I'm like, well, I would say, I can't say that I'm like madly in love with the Branagh's version of Poirot, because in my mind, the accent was just lacking and the mannerisms were lacking. Now, that may have been a purposeful direction that Kenneth Branagh took, because in my mind, there's no one who personifies Hercule Poirot more than David Suchet, who plays Poirot in the BBC series called Poirot. I mean, and there've been, I mean, not Albert Finney. There've been many Poirots. I mean, I want to say Peter Ustinov played Poirot. There've been a number of, or if it wasn't Peter Ustinov, it was somebody else whose name fails to come to mind. But anyway, there've been a number of Poirots throughout cinematic history. No one compares to David Suchet. He is incomparable as that character, as far as I'm concerned. And it's not something that you'll ever see in a movie because it's a television series. So in my mind, does Kenneth Branagh rise to that? No, he doesn't. Mainly because I think the accent is not as good as David Suchet's. And David Suchet just has these mannerisms that can come off as rather affectatious and just sort of, overdone. But because they're so intrinsic to the way in which he portrays the character, it doesn't come off as overdone. It comes off as authentic. I think what Kenneth Branagh did was, let's avoid these sort of overarching mannerisms that have been associated with the Poirot character, and let's kind of tamp that down and focus more on like the way in which his mind works. And that's certainly that's certainly a valid approach, but it loses a little in the translation. On paper, it makes sense to do that approach because you really don't want your characterization sort of confused with the David Suchet, or like a poor man's David Suchet. But on the other hand, it, like I said, it just loses something in the translation, because part of what makes Poirot so interesting is that he has all these weird issues. I mean, the man's OCDC. He's obsessive compulsive. He's OC. He's extremely particular. He has all these rituals that he does, and things like that. I mean, that's just him. So to not see all of that connected with him, it's like, that's part of the fun that kind of went away for the virtue of the logic of what I would call filmmaking, the logic of storytelling. And some of storytelling has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with whimsy. So that's what I was missing. But it was still a very good story, and it definitely held my attention. I mean, part of that is, of course, it's a very good story because Agatha Christie wrote an amazing story to begin with. I mean, let's give credit where credit is due. Agatha Christie wrote one hell of a story. So that was, so you had great source material to begin with,
Hmm.
but Kenneth Branagh, I think, did take a lot of care with details relating to evoking time and place. He brought in, I also like the way in which he employed or found reasons to make the cast more diverse, even though that has nothing to do with the Agatha Christie story. I think that's just something that is a personal goal of his, and I really applaud him for that. And I've always liked that about him. So he has women where maybe in the source story women aren't necessarily called for. He has people of color where they're definitely not called for in the source material, but he finds a way to include them to some extent. And I really like that. So the Leslie Odom character was a doctor, very interesting. Daisy Ridley was this governess who, is, I mean, she's quote unquote a governess, but way smarter than she seems. And, there's Penelope Cruz plays a woman who is very traumatized, as it turns out, she's this nurse who was just completely traumatized by her experiences in I want to say was it World War One? Maybe
What
World. I think it was World War One.
what's the time, the era with the? Do we know like the dates when this is taking
I
place?
can't remember when the original story was written.
Okay.
Um, but
I mean,
I want to say it was World War One because given the dress and given the timing, I think it was World War One.
okay.
So she was just so traumatized, as it turns out. She was a nurse, and something terrible happened that further traumatized her. And so she was this mysterious character that was also interesting. Willem Dafoe was a really interesting character. He plays this, this Nazi, maybe. So, so that was interesting. So, this real assortment of interesting characters who sort of are, and Michelle Pfeiffer, let's not forget Michelle Pfeiffer. She was on there playing a sort of femme fatale type character, a divorced woman who prided herself on being desirable to men, and she didn't necessarily desire them in return. So that, so it was interesting watching her. And I've always liked Michelle Pfeiffer as an actress. So it's just nice to see her. It's nice to see her acting.
Hmm.
She took quite a hiatus for a while, probably to deal with work, raise a family, or whatever. But she's been away, and the first time I remember seeing her was in the Wizard of Lies movie, which was the HBO movie where she played Bernie Madoff's wife, and now this, and very watchable. She also sings the end credit song.
Hmm.
So, and I remembered hearing when I heard that voice, I'm like, that sounds like Michelle Pfeiffer. And I mean, I really loved the way that she sang in The Fabulous Baker Boy. I thought she was terrific. And so it was nice to have her singing. And so, yeah, so I guess, to make a short story really, really long, I really, I was pleasantly surprised at how good the movie was. I was pleasantly surprised at how well it held my attention, although I shouldn't have been because it's Agatha Christie after all. But even with that, in the hands of the wrong people, even an Agatha Christie story can be ruined for the
Hmm.
telling. But Kenneth Branagh didn't. He looked at this story very closely and really tried to find ways to create this wonderful sense of almost like a magical time where trains were they were the lap of luxury. I mean, that was where the rich went to play. and you know, the cars were opulent, the food was impeccable, the service was stunning, you know. um the best chefs in the world worked on these trains, on a train like like the Orient Express. um People slept. They would spend weeks on on a train the way that people might spend weeks on a cruise ship.
Hmm.
That's how decadent it was. There was nothing was too good. And he just made it a point to evoke all of that, and just this sense of other place, these exotic places. And you really just felt like you were swept away into the world of the train, and just amazing way to see the world. So that's why I really like the film.
This is kind of a segue from the movies for a moment, and how you just made that description about the time and how the train was utilized for the rich and the as you said, opulence. Um, we were talking at work, and we have these facts, and we talk about different things. And this was a fact about Indiana. And Studebaker was a company. Studebaker was actually in South Bend, Indiana, and we know Studebaker because the cars and the automobiles, and then this multi-million-dollar organization. And back in the early development of the company, in South Bend, Indiana, Studebaker was known for elaborate horse and buggies.
Mm-hmm.
Way before these cars were even invented, they had
Yep.
been involved in, but these were luxury items for the rich and upper middle class people, because no one else could afford them.
Mm-hmm.
But their clientele was the rich and or famous, or rich and infamous, whatever the case may be, not just in Indiana but across the country. And you, I think a lot of times one of the romantic essence of film is, and especially in Cleveland classic Hollywood, is seeing those types of things, um, and going back and seeing how excuse me, as you alluded to, the train was pretty much the ocean cruiser on land. Um, where you have these food cars and bar cars and all these things on these trains, which you know the common folk couldn't afford to do all that.
Right.
So got very interesting stuff. Yeah, I think I'm gonna watch that, Karen. I kept stopping myself, which is what we're trying to get people not to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing that quite a bit on that film. And um, I like him as an actor. He's such a really good actor, um, and I've seen him in quite a few different things. Um,
You mean Kenneth Branagh?
Kenneth Branagh. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I should have said that. Um, and I think one of my favorite films of him is that he's in is Conspiracy, uh,
Oh yeah.
with
Stanley
Stanley.
Tucci.
Yep, that is a cool film.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
that,
think
that
that's still on Netflix.
yeah, I think so. And that's the World War II era,
Yep.
in that one, and the trying to figure out, it's uh, the Nazi Germany trying to figure out what to do and what's going on, and
From the Nazi perspective.
right.
Of course, my big problem with that movie, I like the movie, but it just drove me crazy that everybody had a freaking British accent. It's like it's Nazi Germany, people. Can you at least like try for some sort of like at least a hard G, something guttural, something that evokes Germany? You shouldn't have these rounded, dulcet tones of the British tongue. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I agree, but yet fortunately the storyline was so good that you
Yes, it
kind of forget
was.
about all that to some degree,
I
and you're
didn't
like,
forget about
I use that operative word, it's really not a word, it's like a phrase, to some degree, um, that you're not paying that much attention to that. And, you know, most of us are not paying that much attention to that. Once we get into the crux of what the film is really about, it's really interesting. Because I was gonna turn it off and I was like, wait, this is really good, and
It
then
was really
it
good.
became very riveting after a while. It was like, wow,
Hmm.
this is the bomb. So yeah,
Hmm.
and Stanley Tucci too, really good actors, both of them. So I watch a lot of films that they're both in, and even a TV series for Brenham, Brenna. Um, he plays a I think either Dutch or
Wallander.
Norwegian. Yeah, I think is it Dutch or Norwegian or
Yeah, it's in Scandinavia, but the
somewhere
name of the series is Wallander.
where he's a detective.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I love detective stuff, ladies and gentlemen. That's my deal. Um, I watch a lot of detective TV shows and movies and all that good stuff. But so the Orient Express should be up my alley. So I'll give it a shot.
Well, there's another movie you mentioned conspiracy. There's another movie having to do with Nazi Germany that was also surprisingly good, and it's a movie that I've seen several times called Valkyrie
Oh, with
with
Tom
Tom
Cruise.
Cruise. Yes, Tom Cruise and Tom Wilkinson, Bill Nye. So again, a largely British cast for this movie. Tom Cruise was like one of the outliers as an American. And it was really interesting because the movie, deals with an historical event, which is this is relatively late in World War II, but there was a conspiracy amongst some of the high ranking generals in Nazi Germany to find a way to take Hitler out because they'd become scared, kind of like in the game, if you ask me, but they'd become scared about how truly wackadoo the head of the Third Reich was, and that the country was basically going off on the rails, and to save the country, they needed to get rid of Hitler. And so a cadre of high-ranking generals sort of conspired to create a situation where they could blow up Hitler, and it didn't work, and they were, I think, they were pretty much all captured and all executed.
Hmm.
So anyway, I'm not giving anything away by saying this because this was an actual historical event that happened. And just check it out on Google or Wikipedia if you want to know more about it. And the movie, I think, you know, I mean, I'm sure that there were dramatic liberties taken with the movie, but Tom Cruise played an actual person um, who lived and was part of this conspiracy. In fact, spearheaded the conspiracy. He played this man who was very much caught up in the glory of the Third Reich and what the Third Reich was supposed to mean and all this other stuff. And when he came home from the war after being severely injured, he was just shocked at what victory for the Third Reich could mean for the overall for the condition of the world. And he was like, we have to do something. So Tom Cruise played that character. Anyway, this was another movie, didn't get great reviews, and
Hmm.
like I said, I've watched it several times because I think it's a really interesting story. How do you get from point A where you're all in to point B where you're like, this has got to stop? How does that journey take place? What
Hmm.
happens to that person? And then to me, that's almost always an interesting question. And that's and when at some point do you draw the line in the sand and say, enough, no more, up, you will not cross this line? And how much courage does it take to say that? That to me is always an interesting makes for an interesting telling of a story. And so that's why, Valkyrie to me is just very watchable.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've discussed a few films, especially our primary films, about finding a film that you really didn't want to give a whole bunch of credence and then end up liking it so much that you've got to talk about it. And so we've taken that movie um, journey and found that it was a good one. So we're hoping that you can find some films out there, and the ones that we've mentioned definitely, but some films out there that you give it a shot. You never know how really good a film is until you watch it anyway. But um, don't always shy away from a movie that looks like it might be okay, and you think, give it a shot. Go that next point, that next step to try to see if that movie is worth it or not. Now, obviously, it's not going to be every movie, but you'll be surprised the ones that you may have taken yourself away from that you find that you truly enjoy. So that was the whole point of our show today. Find a movie out there that you put aside or weren't thinking of really watching. It perked your interest a little, and you said, we'll give it a shot. Give it a shot. Thanks for listening to us here on A Real Point of View, and we'll be back next time with hopefully some other inspirational movies for you to watch. And uh, you hope you'll come back and give us that opportunity to show you some more films out there that might be really cool. So thanks again for watching A Real Point of View. And Karen, thanks again for joining me here as my co-host. Always
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
My
And
pleasure.
I guess we're going to say goodnight for today, and I'll be back again on another date. Thanks for watching. Check us out on the YouTube channel for other episodes. And if nothing else, find a movie, enjoy that movie, and if you can even leave us comments and let us know what you found, and maybe we'll highlight that in or converse about it on our show one day. Thanks again, and take care, everybody.
Night, everybody.